When Dissidia Arcade was announced all the way back in 2015 at the Japanese Amusement Expo, there were many of us within the community that were filled with giddy excitement, as on a superficial level, what they showed off looked nothing short of amazing compared to what we'd previously been accustomed to with the PlayStation Portable versions. But it wasn't just the visuals that impressed, there were many other reasons to be excited. Even though it was announced as being an exclusive game for Japanese arcades, it was done so with the promise that the game will be ported over to home consoles following its launch. And within the original reveal, they also showed off an array of characters that spanned both the original Dissidia and its sequel, Duodecim, while hinting that newer characters will be represented too, thanks to the addition of Y'shtola from Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. There was also a lot of curiosity around the new 3v3 mechanic that had been put in place by the new leadership team of Takeo Kujiraoka, the game's director, who had previously worked on the battle systems of the original Dissidia and Final Fantasy XIII-2, and Yosuke Hayashi, the executive producer from Team Ninja, who was the producer and director of Ninja Gaiden 3 and Metroid Other M amongst other titles. They decided that based on what the original ambition was for Dissidia Arcade, that they had to move away from 1v1, and there were numerous reasons as to why. For one, they wanted to make sure they weren't competing with Dead or Alive in the arcades, but from a game design perspective, they also wanted to create a fighting experience that would allow people to play with their friends, harkening back to the party concept that has been so prevalent within the history of the Final Fantasy franchise, which also makes a lot of sense when you consider that Final Fantasy XI is Kujiraoka's favourite game in the franchise. All of this summed together to project grand visions of what a Dissidia could be on home consoles, an experience that would allow gamers around the world to fulfill their dualistic fantasies, squaring off their favourite Final Fantasy characters against each other in glorious high-definition graphics, in a much more fitting way than the PlayStation Portable could ever handle due to the new team dynamic and the online infrastructure capabilities. Interest therefore grew as the game's Japanese launch drew closer, and this was helped of course by the grand reveal of the initial array of characters who gamers would be able to play upon launch. And according to Square Enix's fiscal reports, it was a hit when it launched in the arcades with over 3,000 units sold in its initial run. But from outside of Japan, this launch hype train was a bit of an anticlimax, and not just because we didn't actually get the game at the end of it. It was mainly because there was no surprise. It was just the same cast of characters we'd seen in the original Dissidia, and although in the months that followed we did see the reveal of Ramza and Ace, by the time Noctis was announced 2 years later at the Tokyo Game Show in the build up to the game's then upcoming release on the PlayStation 4, momentum had well and truly been lost. And this was reflected by views on the YouTube character announcements. Outside of Sephiroth, which still remains the most viewed Dissidia reveal trailer on the Japanese Square Enix YouTube channel where they effectively announce characters globally, views continue to decrease over time, and the announcement of Jecht actually ended up garnering more interest than the announcement of Noctis, despite it releasing on the PlayStation 4 only a few months later. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly why this was, but if I were to make an educated guess, it'd be around the amount of time everything was taking between character releases, but also how long the port actually took to happen. And of course, the revelations that had come out about just how different NT would be from the PSP versions that people love so dearly probably didn't help either. Perhaps wrongly, there was a long-held belief that when Dissidia Arcade was ported, it would be brought more in line with those previous experiences, and when initial discussions started happening towards the start of 2017, this looked to be the case, and Kazushige Nojima was even touted as overseeing the new scenario. But upon the game's official reveal during E3 of that year, it came out that the offline aspect of the game, notably the story mode, was going to be very bare and rather different from what we'd seen before. It meant that despite receiving a load of coverage due to an open beta in the build-up to its PlayStation 4 release, Dissidia NT did not hit the ground running as Square Enix had surely hoped it would, and they've been trying to play catch-up ever since, with the release of numerous patches and DLC characters hoping to draw people back into the world of Dissidia. It's kind of worked, and in Japan at least, the game has managed to almost double its launch sales in the year that followed. But now, with the game passing its 1-year anniversary, they seem more determined than ever to drive home that Dissidia NT is here to stay. They're working hard towards the goal of bringing people back, with the hope of redeeming themselves in the eyes of the fanbase. The announcement and subsequent releases of Yuna and Snow have seen the game gain some momentum for its 1-year anniversary, And in addition to the recent major news announcements, this can be seen as a step in the right direction. This came in the form of 2 announcements, that Dissidia NT is going free to play and that it will be launching on the PC. And in the spirit of working towards this wider goal of bringing people back, Square Enix invited me to come into their offices and re-engage with Dissidia NT along with a host of other different kinds of content creators. And we did so, playing on top tier gaming PCs to celebrate its release on that platform. It was an amazing opportunity, but the truth is that it had actually been a while since I'd had any exposure to Dissidia NT, so the first thing I did upon receiving the invitation was download all the recent patches and jump back into the fray, so as to try and reacquaint myself with everything. In this regard, I'd like to give a small shout out to our Discord server, as quite a few of the people on there are still actively playing Dissidia NT, like Echo, our resident Dissidia expert. If you'd like to connect with other Dissidia players, I would definitely recommend signing up, and there's a convenient link in the description below. Anyway, the first thing I noticed upon re-engaging with Dissidia NT via some offline gauntlets was that the game still looks rather gorgeous. The second thing was that when you're rusty, Dissidia NT holds no punches, and after picking Tidus and forgetting that his mechanics are rather specific, the AI proceeded to hand me my arse as I ventured into the platinum tier fights. Nonetheless, after venturing back to check out the new fights within the game's story mode thanks to the recent additions of Vayne, Camelot and Snow, doing some more gauntlets and a couple of online bouts, I felt as ready as I was ever going to be. And it was worth it, as it meant I could feel right at home for what would come, a 4-hour session of Dissidia NT at the Square Enix London office, where we were split into 2 specific teams to duke it out and fight for ultimate supremacy. Having played a decent amount of the game when it actually launched, I wasn't quite sure what to expect from the day, but the experience helped to remind me of just how fun this game can be. Playing with a small group of people, we were able to share in the highs and lows, such as my fun duel against Onion Knight when playing as Ace, my terrible game as Kefka, and when I picked Riot Blade for our Triple Terror match before being educated on what it actually did. But the interesting thing was that even though we didn't know each other beforehand, by the end of the session we were talking about complementary party setups and basic strategies that we would employ as we looked for victory in the final best of 3 showdown that rounded out the session. For reference, we settled on the following combination: Garland, who is played by a fighting esports commentator called Jammers, Terra, who is being played by a YouTuber called Adelicate, and me playing as Cloud. And I'm glad to say that we were victorious with a 2-1 victory against 2 Twitch and YouTube creators called Javian and Inochi and their on-loan rotating Square Enix employee, which was obviously rather satisfying. But anyway, small event success aside, what's interesting about these developments in a wider sense though is that they should naturally increase Dissidia NT's player base, something which it has desperately needed. Tying in with its launch on PC, there will now be 3 distinct versions of Dissidia NT available on both the PC and the PlayStation 4, Free, Standard and Deluxe. The Free Edition will allow you to play offline and online battles with 4 pre-selected characters that will change weekly, and although you won't have access to the game's story, you will still be able to play against users from all versions on the same system. Plus, if you choose to upgrade to another version of the game, everything you've done will be ported over. You'll also be able to purchase characters and cosmetic options like skins and weapons separately as add-ons, should you find one that you rather enjoy. And doing it this way makes it much more cost effective when compared to just purchasing the standard edition, which is just, well, the default version of the game that launched on the PlayStation 4 earlier last year. Deluxe then comes with the 6 DLC characters, their weapons and costumes, as well as 2 colour variants of those characters and 2 additional weapons. One oddity with all of this though is that the DLC characters won't be made available within the rotation of the free version, and you won't be able to purchase them separately as far as I'm aware. They will only be available as a set. Perhaps it's due to arrangements relating to how the season pass is presented and packaged, but it's still a bit strange. Either way, utilising the free-to-play model is of course a risky strategy, as you need a coherent experience and a dedicated community to pull it off. Games like League of Legends and more recently Fortnite and Apex Legends have shown just how successful it can be, but Dissidia NT isn't those games, and despite the positive steps we're seeing, there are still improvements that can be made to help it become more appealing in the long term. One of these changes does relate to the architecture around online play. Without a doubt, this needs to be sped up so you can enter into a new fight shortly after your previous one is finished. If you're playing with friends, this isn't so much of an issue, but for solo players, this can be a real buzzkill, as sometimes looking for a fight can last longer than the actual fight itself, and if you're on the end of an unfortunate hiding, that's just no good. Then there's the offline support. In Japan, there's a pretty good tournament scene for Dissidia, and back in December, there was a tournament hosted by KVO that featured 117 players. In the UK, the tournament scene isn't quite as bustling, and although some steps were made in the US, as you can see from the official tournament section, it's quite limited with no real support from Square Enix outside of listing tournaments. Here's hoping in 2019, steps can be taken to try and push this a little bit harder. Another change comes with the characters they're planning to add in the future. What they released during the first season pass was a bit hit and miss, and it feels as though the plan was set in stone based on the assumption that the game would be successful upon launch. Rinoa, Yuna and Snow were clearly the much bigger draws out of the 6 characters, and it would have probably made sense to surface these guys sooner rather than later, but here we are, and there will surely be some lessons learned when it comes to Season 2. Now, there's no official indication yet as to which characters will arrive in Season 2, but according to a leak last year, there are some big hitters on the horizon. Characters like Tifa Lockhart, Gilgamesh, Laguna Loire and Judge Gabranth were mentioned as returning characters, and Vivi and Zack Fair looking like new arrivals. Each of them would garner quite a lot of interest, and it will be exciting to see how accurate the data mine was. But there is of course a whole host of potential other characters, and when the game was announced, they shared with Dengeki Online that they had drawn up a list of 50 prospective characters, 31 of which have already featured in Dissidia. It makes sense then that it feels like the developers keep mentioning different options almost every time they speak, as well as consistently highlighting that they also want to ensure that every character from the original 2 games is added as a priority, something they stressed again in an interview with French fansite Finneland. When speaking with IGN Singapore, Kujiraoka-san and Hazama-san mentioned their desire to add Noel Kreis and Oren, but in the past they've spoken about the inclusion of Zack Fair from the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, Aranea Highwind from Final Fantasy XV, and even Umaru from Final Fantasy VI. Tetsuya Nomura, who's the creative producer on Dissidia NT, has also spoken about wanting to include Minwu from Final Fantasy II, and even outside of that there are options from within the other business divisions at Square Enix. Back in 2017, Naoki Yoshida, the producer and director of Final Fantasy XIV, told us that he'd really love to see characters like Nail Vandanas from Final Fantasy XIV represented in the game. Basically, there are multiple angles they can pursue to try and ensure Dissidia NT grabs people's attention and then manages to keep it long enough for them to become invested. And here's hoping that they can crack that code, because even though Dissidia NT is quite different from the 2 games that came before on the PlayStation Portable, outside of the queue times and the occasional frame rate drops, it's a good experience, especially if you can buddy up with some friends to enjoy it with you. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching this video about Dissidia NT. I appreciate that it's a bit of a change of pace compared to everything else we've been putting out recently, especially as we haven't covered Dissidia NT on the channel for some time, but it was nice to engage with the game again. Despite the negatives that are associated with it, playing NT over the past week has reminded me of the positives it featured, and I'm genuinely hopeful that the developers can turn it around and make it a fun experience for everyone to enjoy. Oddly enough, even before the free-to-play announcement, we had quite a few people within the Final Fantasy Union community who had just started picking the game up again, so it's as good a time as any if you've held off before. And after chilling out and playing it for a solid session with the guys at Square Enix, it helped to highlight to me how engaging it can be. Even though we played for 4 hours solid, it really did not feel like it. If you guys enjoyed this video, please do consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. We have plenty of fun content on the horizon, including an Origins video for a game we haven't yet ventured into. We're going to try and keep things interesting with our pipeline, but we are of course always open to suggestions. If you'd like to join us on our journey to continue producing high quality Final Fantasy content, then please do consider supporting us on Patreon. You can now support us and become an official member of the MOG Squad for just $1 per month. And for $5 per month, you can gain access to exclusive behind the scenes content where we talk about creating our videos, amongst other things. The link to our Patreon is in the description below if you're interested. Alright everyone, thank you so much for listening to me ramble on about Dissidia NT. Be sure to check out the Discord server if you'd like to find some people to play with, and I'm sure I'll see you again soon for more Final Fantasy videos.